The year 1868 draped itself over Harmony Creek, Missouri, like a suffocating blanket woven from heat and the lingering silence of a war recently concluded. This was not a town marked by bustling commerce or the clamor of progress, but rather a collection of resilient homesteads, each etched into the rugged embrace of the Ozark foothills. A single meandering dirt path, rutted and dust-choked, served as the valley's tenuous artery, connecting families whose lives were intertwined by generations of shared solitude and an almost supernatural quietude. Here, existence was a rhythmic cycle of planting and harvest, of birth and the rare, solemn passing. Yet, what distinguished Harmony Creek, what lent it an almost mythical quality in the annals of forgotten places, was a peculiar, enduring truth. In the collective memory of its inhabitants, no one had died within its boundaries for over half a century. Not a single soul. This extraordinary longevity was not a subject of boastful claims, but rather a quiet, deeply held conviction, whispered from grandparent to grandchild by the flickering light of hearth fires. Old Man Hemlock, his face a roadmap of time and toil, recalled his own grandfather speaking of the Great Fever of 1808, a harsh winter that had claimed a handful of infants. But since that distant sorrow, the valley had been untouched by the reaper's scythe. They attributed it to the crystalline purity of the spring water, perhaps, or the impenetrable embrace of the surrounding mountains, which seemed to ward off the maladies and misfortunes of the wider world. The folk of Harmony Creek were a hardy breed, their days marked by physical labor and simple pleasures. Illness, it seemed, passed them by. Violence rarely touched their quiet lives, and age, when it finally arrived, crept upon them with a gentle, drawn-out grace like a fading sunset. It was into this sanctuary of life, this bastion against mortality, that the disruption arrived. Not with a bang or a shout, but with the quiet, unsettling presence of a stranger. He emerged from the dense woods, a figure cloaked in dark, travel-worn clothes, carrying no obvious possessions save for a polished wooden urn, its surface gleaming like dried blood in the harsh afternoon light. He clutched it to his chest as one might hold a sacred, fragile thing. His name, he offered in a voice softer than the rustle of autumn leaves, was Elias Thorne. His eyes, though polite, held a profound weariness, as if burdened by a grief that transcended the immediate moment. He had come, he explained, to lay his sister to rest. A simple request, one might initially assume, born of a universally understood sorrow. But in Harmony Creek, a place where every birth was chronicled and every passing mourned with a communal reverence, the notion of a death within their valley was an anomaly, a profound contradiction to their very identity. The news, carried on the hot, dry breeze, swept through the scattered homesteads like a spark in dry tinder. It traveled over rickety fences, was whispered across dusty fields, and exchanged in hushed tones beside the life-giving spring. A death. Here. Impossible. The small overgrown cemetery, nestled on a low rise overlooking the valley, had lain undisturbed for decades. Its few crumbling headstones belonged to the initial settlers, names almost erased by time and the elements, their stories long swallowed by the earth. The very thought of digging a fresh grave, of scarring their immaculate ground with a new marker, felt profoundly wrong, almost a violation of the unspoken covenant they shared with the land itself. And then there was the urn, a dark, enigmatic vessel, its presence a stark, tangible contradiction to their shared history, to their proud, quiet immunity to death. What kind of person arrived with cremated remains in a place where cremation was utterly unheard of, viewed with a primal suspicion and unease? And why Harmony Creek, this isolated speck on the map, for such a solemn, yet undeniably alien ceremony? The sun continued its relentless descent. The cicadas hummed their endless song, but a new, cold tremor had begun to weave itself into the heart of the community. A deep, unsettling stillness had been broken, and the once predictable rhythm of their lives had subtly, terrifyingly, begun to falter. Elias Thorne, despite his almost monastic quietude, found himself ensnared in the invisible web of Harmony Creek's collective scrutiny. He rented a small, dilapidated cabin, a structure that had stood vacant and forgotten for longer than even Old Man Hemlock could recall, its window panes like vacant, unblinking eyes staring out at the untamed wilderness. Thorn moved with a solitary purpose, spending his days meticulously tending to a small, overgrown patch of ground near the cabin. It was a spot he evidently intended for his sister's final resting place, and his movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if performing a sacred duty understood only by himself. He rarely ventured into the heart of the community, relying on a tacit understanding that supplies would be left near his door, paid for with coin always left in a neat pile. The inhabitants of Harmony Creek, a hardy blend of farmers and woodsmen, were not accustomed to subtlety. They observed him from afar, their queries relayed through the hesitant words of children sent on errands or the calculating, sidelong glances of those who might pass his cabin on their way to the spring. Elias offered little in the way of explanation beyond his initial, terse statement about his sister. When pressed, gently, by the occasional neighbor, he spoke of her only in vague, ethereal terms. A delicate soul, prone to ailments, who had harbored a fervent desire to be buried in a place of profound peace, a haven untouched by the harshness and decay of the outside world. He would then turn back to his work, his hands busy, his gaze distant, effectively ending the conversation. This persistent vagueness, rather than assuaging their concerns, only fueled the growing unease. Why Harmony Creek? If Ilara was indeed so frail, how could she have endured the arduous journey to this impossibly isolated valley? And what insidious ailment could have claimed her in a place where sickness seemed to fear to tread? A place so blessed by longevity. The questions hung in the humid air, unanswered, festering like unseen wounds beneath the surface of their placid lives. Elias, with his perpetually dark suit, his mournful, distant gaze, and his unyielding silence, was an enigma in a community built upon the bedrock of familiarity, shared histories, and generations of interwoven stories. He did not fit, and his presence was a disquieting foreign body, a splinter in their collective consciousness. Old Man Hemlock, his back stooped by years of labor but his mind as sharp as a newly honed blade, felt the weight of the community's unspoken anxieties. He decided, after much deliberation, that a direct approach was necessary. He found Thorn meticulously clearing stones from the chosen burial plot, his brow furrowed in concentration. Hemlock, blunt as the axe he carried slung over his shoulder, opened with a polite greeting, then cut to the heart of the matter. He asked him outright about the ashes, about the sister, about the unlikelihood of a death in Harmony Creek. Elias paused, his hands still on a small stone, then slowly turned. His eyes, though weary, held a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps profound sorrow, perhaps something far darker. A secret held so tightly it warped the air around him. He merely repeated, softly but firmly, that his sister had wished, above all else, to rest in a peaceful place. Hemlock persisted, his tone gentle yet unyielding, pressing the question of why Harmony Creek, a place so utterly removed from any established route, any map, would be her chosen sanctuary. Elias hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the distant, hazy peaks of the Ozarks. He then spoke of a childhood memory, a distant relative, a great-aunt perhaps, who had once spoken of the valley as a hidden haven, a place of untouched, almost mythical beauty. It was a flimsy explanation, thin as a cobweb, one that did little to assuage Hemlock's deepening suspicions. But Elias offered no more. The old man left, his heart heavy with a premonition that something far more complex, and perhaps far more sinister, lay beneath Elias Thorne's quiet sorrow, something that whispered of secrets buried deeper than any grave. The proposed burial date drew relentlessly closer, and with its approach, the collective tension in Harmony Creek escalated, palpable as the suffocating summer humidity. The women of the community, usually quick to offer comfort and aid in times of mourning, kept their distance, their usual compassionate instincts overridden by a pervasive unease. The men, typically quick to lend a strong back and a shovel for a grave, found an endless litany of reasons to be busy elsewhere. Fences needed mending, crops required tending, Distant woods demanded their attention. It was an unspoken boycott, a collective, almost primal resistance to the intrusion of death into their sanctuary, a defiance against the disruption of their peculiar, blessed normalcy. Elias Thorne, seemingly oblivious or perhaps simply uncaring of their silent protest, continued his preparations alone, his solitary figure a stark silhouette against the backdrop of their apprehension. One sweltering afternoon, the heat so intense it shimmered above the fields, a group of young boys, driven by that potent cocktail of daring and insatiable curiosity, ventured close to Thorne's cabin. They had absorbed the adults' hushed whispers, the unsettling stories of the man with the urn, and their childish imaginations were alight with tales of ghosts and hidden secrets. They crept through the tall, dry grass, their bare feet silent on the dusty ground, until they were close enough to observe Thorne. He was deeper now. The pit he dug a dark, yawning maw in the parched earth, and the enigmatic urn rested carefully on a small, makeshift altar of flat stones nearby, almost reverently placed. What they saw next, though seemingly innocuous at first glance, sent a shiver through their young bones, a cold thread of apprehension that, when recounted, solidified the community's burgeoning unease. Thorne paused his digging, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and then, with a strange, almost obsessive gesture, he began to trace the outlines of the faded names on the oldest headstones in the forgotten cemetery, which lay just beyond his cabin. Not the prominent, later markers, but the barely legible carvings on the most ancient, most weathered stones, almost swallowed by time, moss, and encroaching ivy. His finger moved slowly, deliberately, as if deciphering a forgotten script, or perhaps memorizing each crumbling character. When the boys, breathless and wide-eyed, reported this back to their parents, the adults exchanged troubled, knowing glances. Why would a man ostensibly consumed by grief for his recently departed sister be so utterly engrossed in the forgotten dead of Harmony Creek? It was an odd fixation, unsettling in its intensity, a deviation from the expected rituals of mourning. Old Man Hemlock, upon hearing this peculiar detail, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He suddenly recalled something his grandmother had told him, a fragmented piece of folklore usually dismissed as mere fancy. The very oldest graves in that small, overgrown plot belonged to the initial settlers, a small, insular group who, according to the faint oral traditions, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only those weathered markers. The land had lain fallow for many years, untouched, before new families, their own ancestors, had finally arrived to build the Harmony Creek known today. The mystery of the vanished settlers was a faded campfire story, rarely spoken of in polite company, often dismissed as a peculiar, romanticized quirk of the valley's history. But Elias Thorne's undeniable interest in those specific, almost illegible names, coupled with his unyielding insistence on burying his sister in a place where, by all accounts, no one had died in generations, created an insidious, chilling connection. A cold tremor, deeper than any summer night chill, began to creep into the hearts of the Harmony Creek folk. The profound peace they had so long cherished, the quiet immunity they believed they possessed, suddenly felt fragile, threatened by an unseen force, a dark premonition emanating directly from the stranger and his enigmatic urn. The past, they sensed, was stirring, and its awakening was far from benign. The day of the burial finally arrived, hot and oppressive, the air thick and still. Elias Thorne stood alone by the open grave, a solitary figure dwarfed by the surrounding silence, the dark urn clutched tightly in his hands. No one from Harmony Creek attended, not even out of morbid curiosity. The silence was profound, broken only by the incessant buzzing of unseen insects and the distant, mournful caw of a crow echoing through the valley. He lowered the urn into the freshly turned earth himself, his movements slow and deliberate, precise, as if performing a sacred, solitary communion with the ground. He then filled the grave, patting the earth with a gentle, almost reverent care that was unnerving in its isolation, a testament to a private sorrow or a hidden agenda. Later that week, a subtle, Yet profound change began to manifest in Elias Thorne. He still kept to himself, maintaining his isolation, but his mournful demeanor seemed to subtly lift, replaced by a strange, almost imperceptible air of quiet satisfaction. The profound grief that had seemed to weigh him down like a shroud appeared to lessen, giving way to a new focused energy. He began to explore the valley, not with the aim of casual discovery or leisurely strolls, but with a strange, almost methodical purpose. His wanderings seemed drawn to the valley's oldest, most forgotten corners. He visited the ancient, abandoned well on the outskirts of the old, long-vanished settlement, a well that had long since dried up, its rough-hewn stones crumbling and overgrown with tenacious vines. He would stand there for long periods, gazing intently into its dark, empty depths, as if searching for something profoundly lost, something hidden within its shadows, beyond the reach of light. The well, like the forgotten graves, was another crumbling relic of the vanished first settlers. Local lore held that they had dug it deeper than any other in the valley, believing its waters held a unique, almost miraculous purity, an essence of the land itself. When they disappeared, the well slowly, inexplicably dried up, its emptiness a stark, silent reminder of their unknown fate. Now, Elias Thorne seemed drawn to it, his fascination a silent, unsettling question mark hanging in the humid, still air. What did he see in its empty maw? What hidden connection did he draw between the dry, ancient stones and the ashes he had so solemnly interred? What secret did he believe it held? Old man Hemlock, his heart heavy with an escalating sense of foreboding, felt an irresistible pull towards the well himself. The questions surrounding Thorne's behavior gnawed at him, refusing to be silenced. He approached the well after Thorne had left one afternoon, the air around it seeming colder, denser than the rest of the valley. He peered into its shadowed depths, seeing nothing but profound darkness and a few fallen, moss-covered stones. But as he turned to leave, his foot snagged on something partially buried in the dry, cracked earth near the well's mossy edge. He knelt, his old hands brushing away the dust and clinging debris, and uncovered a small, tarnished silver locket. It was old, intricately engraved with delicate, unfamiliar patterns, but blank inside. No faded daguerreotype, no loving inscription, just empty space. A hollow, silent promise. Hemlock showed the locket to the few remaining elders who still remembered the faint echoes of the old stories. They recognized the distinctive style, a common design among the initial, vanished settlers. It was a small detail, seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet it forged a chilling, undeniable link between Thorne's strange fascination with the well and the valley's oldest, most unsettling mystery. The locket felt like a forgotten whisper, a tangible echo of lives long lost, now disturbingly brought to light by the arrival of a man who claimed to carry the ashes of someone who had died in a place where death was unknown. The threads of the valley's past and unsettling present were beginning to intertwine in a deeply disquieting way, weaving a tapestry of dread that threatened to unravel the very fabric of Harmony Creek's long-held peace. With the passing weeks, Elias Thorne's presence in Harmony Creek subtly shifted from being a mere point of overt suspicion to a source of lingering, atmospheric dread. He rarely spoke, his words as sparse as water in a desert, but his quiet movements, his focused attention on the forgotten, liminal corners of the valley, created an oppressive weight that seemed to settle over everything. The children, usually boisterous and free-spirited, now played closer to home, their laughter subdued, their eyes darting towards the tree line where Thorne might be seen. The women, who once congregated at the creek for the communal chore of washing clothes, now went in smaller, hushed groups, their heads bowed, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods. A collective fear, a tight knot in their chests. Thorne himself seemed to possess an almost spectral quality. He was everywhere and nowhere. He was seen meticulously cleaning the old moss-covered headstones of the vanished settlers, even those whose names were utterly erased by time and weather, polishing them with a strange, possessive care. He spent hours by the dried-up well, sometimes simply sitting motionless, sometimes running his fingers over the rough, ancient stones, as if deciphering a forgotten language etched into their very being. His cabin, once dark and uninviting, now emitted a faint, flickering light late into the night, suggesting he was engaged in some solitary, arcane study, a secret pursuit that consumed his waking hours. The rhythm of his life was alien, disturbing in its quiet intensity. Then the strange occurrences began, subtly at first, like faint echoes from a distant, forgotten dream. A faint, almost imperceptible chill in the air, even on the hottest, most humid days, seemed to emanate directly from the vicinity of Thorne's cabin, a cold breath in the summer heat. Objects in homes would sometimes shift, just slightly, enough to make one pause, to question if they had merely misplaced it, or if something unseen had moved it in their absence. A forgotten lullaby, one sung by the original settlers and passed down through faint, fragmented memory, was sometimes heard on the evening wind, a mournful, wordless tune that sent shivers down the spine of those who heard it, a melody of sorrow and longing. It was more than just a feeling of unease. It was a profound sense of being watched, of an unseen presence that now permeated the comforting isolation of Harmony Creek, an entity that had never before dared to intrude upon their tranquil existence. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Old Man Hemlock, returning from checking his traps deep in the woods, took the winding path that led past Thorne's cabin. As he drew near, a low, rhythmic sound reached him from within, a sound like wood scraping against stone, or perhaps something being systematically ground. It was dull, persistent, and strangely hypnotic. He paused, hidden by the deepening gloom and the protective cover of the trees, and watched the flickering yellowish light within the cabin through a narrow gap in the curtains. Thorne was silhouetted against the window, bent over a table, his movements precise and repetitive, almost ritualistic. It was impossible to discern what he was doing, but the sound was persistent, an unnerving counterpoint to the chirping crickets and the rustle of leaves. Hemlock felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The man had buried ashes, claiming them to be his sisters. Yet he seemed to be engaged in some kind of continuous, meticulous work, a work that involved grinding, perhaps even creating, more of the same. The connection to the locket, to the faded names on the oldest gravestones, to the dry well, and to the increasingly unsettling atmosphere, now seemed to coalesce into a chilling, horrifying implication. Elias Thorne was not just burying the dead. He was intimately connected to the very fabric of Harmony Creek's forgotten past, a past that suddenly felt very much alive and very hungry for something unknown. The unsettling atmosphere continued to deepen its insidious hold on Harmony Creek. The subtle shifts in household objects, the phantom chill that now permeated even the hottest days, and the haunting, wordless melody on the wind intensified, becoming more frequent, more insistent. It was as if the valley itself was awakening to a forgotten, terrible history, spurred into a malevolent consciousness by Elias Thorne's peculiar, relentless presence. The community, once resolute in their avoidance of him, now felt a chilling, almost hypnotic compulsion to understand, to pierce the veil of his profound secret, to uncover the truth behind the ashes and the eerie silence. A group of younger men, their patience worn thin by the escalating fear and a desperate, gnawing need for answers, finally decided to act. They were men of simple faith and hard labor, but the unnatural circumstances had pushed them to the brink. Under the oppressive cover of a moonless night, the stars swallowed by an oppressive cloud cover, they stealthily approached Elias Thorne's cabin. The rhythmic scraping sound, which Old Man Hemlock had heard days prior, was still audible. A low, persistent thrum in the profound darkness, a heartbeat of unseen, macabre labor. They crept closer, their every breath held, their hearts pounding in their chests. Peering through a narrow, splintered crack in the cabin's rickety shutters, their breath hitched in their throats, a collective gasp swallowed by the night, at the sight that unfolded before them. Elias Thorne was not grinding grain, nor was he polishing wood, as some had morbidly imagined. He was meticulously, almost lovingly, grinding fragments of bone. Spread out on his rough-hewn table, illuminated by the guttering flame of a single tallow candle, were small, brittle pieces, some no larger than a thumbnail, others larger, disturbingly recognizable as fragments of human bone. He used a heavy mortar and pestle, his movements slow, deliberate, and chillingly precise, reducing the larger pieces to a fine, grayish dust that he then carefully collected in small, perfectly arranged glass vials. The vials, lined up with an unnerving orderliness, bore small handwritten labels. And on each label, written in a precise, almost elegant script, were names that, with a sickening jolt, matched the faded, ancient markers in the forgotten cemetery just beyond his cabin. Names that belonged to the earliest, vanished settlers of Harmony Creek. The men recoiled in silent horror, their initial courage curdling into a profound, stomach-lurching revulsion. Their silent retreat was a frantic, stumbling scramble through the dense, thorny brush surrounding the cabin. The implications of what they had witnessed were staggering, horrifying beyond immediate comprehension. Elias Thorne was not just burying the dead, he was in some chilling, macabre way collecting them. He was disturbing the oldest graves, systematically extracting their remains, and transforming them into the very dust he claimed to have brought with him in the dark wooden urn. The urn, they now realized with a sickening jolt of understanding, likely contained not the ashes of his sister, but a macabre composite, a terrifying amalgamation of the long-forgotten dead of Harmony Creek, gathered and processed by his own unholy hands. News of the discovery ripped through the valley, not in hushed whispers now, but in frantic, raw exclamations of terror and disbelief. The women wept openly, their faces etched with a profound fear that transcended mere apprehension. The men gripped their tools, axes, shovels, rifles, their faces grim and resolute, hardening with a mixture of righteous fury and a desperate, primal dread. The peaceful sanctuary they had cherished for generations, the place they believed was blessed with an unnatural immunity to death, was now revealed to be a graveyard, not just of a few forgotten settlers, but of a chilling truth that Elias Thorne, the man who brought the urn, was systematically unearthing. The serenity of Harmony Creek was a monstrous lie, and the pervasive silence, once a comfort, was now a terrifying, complicit accomplice to an unspeakable act. The very ground beneath their feet, they now knew, held secrets far older and far more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. Panic, cold and sharp as a winter's blade, began to spread like a contagion through Harmony Creek. The community, once isolated by choice, by a desire for peace and untouched simplicity, now felt trapped within the very valley that had promised them sanctuary. Elias Thorne, no longer a mere enigmatic stranger, had transformed into an active, horrifying threat. His meticulous work with the bones a direct violation of their sacred ground, their deeply held beliefs, and their very sense of identity. The insistent, desperate question of why he was doing this screamed in their minds, echoing the low, constant hum of fear that now permeated every corner of their lives, every breath they took. Old Man Hemlock, his voice trembling with age and a newfound urgency but resolute in his purpose, gathered the able-bodied men. There was no longer any room for hesitation or avoidance. They had to confront Thorne, had to stop him before he irrevocably defiled what little peace remained. Armed with their sturdy shovels, their well-honed axes, and a desperate, unyielding courage born of violated sanctity, they descended upon his cabin at the first blush of dawn. The cabin door stood ajar, almost as if an invitation, a strange, unnerving welcome into the heart of his macabre workshop. The cabin itself was empty, but the undeniable evidence of Thorne's chilling work lay exposed for all to see. The grinding tools, still bearing traces of bone dust, the empty, carefully labeled vials, the dust-covered table. It was a gruesome tableau, an altar to desecration. And then they saw it. A newly dug, shallow trench, its earth freshly turned, stretching like a gaping wound from the back of the cabin directly towards the ancient, overgrown cemetery. They followed the trench, their steps heavy on the damp morning earth, their eyes wide with a mixture of profound dread and a morbid, terrible fascination. The trench led them directly to the oldest, most eroded gravestones, those bearing the names that Elias Thorne had so meticulously traced, names that had been whispered on the labels of his horrifying vials. The graves were undeniably disturbed, the earth freshly turned, indicating that Thorne had been actively exhuming them, systematically retrieving their long-buried occupants. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow, a sickening wave of comprehension. The names on the vials in his cabin were not just labels, they were the very identities of the long dead, now violated and transformed by his chilling, unholy quest. Their ancestors, their valley's first guardians, had been desecrated. As they stood amidst the disturbed graves, the air thick with a pervasive sense of violation, a faint, persistent scraping sound reached them from the direction of the old, dried-up well, a sound that resonated with the same unnerving rhythm they had heard emanating from his cabin. With renewed resolve, their faces grim, they moved towards it, their steps heavy on the dusty ground, their weapons gripped tight. There, at the very bottom of the long empty well, amidst the crumbling stones and dry, cracked earth, was Elias Thorne. He was not digging. He looked at them, his eyes holding that same unreadable weariness but now tinged with a faint, almost triumphant satisfaction, a quiet sense of accomplishment. He said nothing, simply held up the box, almost reverently, as if presenting a sacred trophy, a long-sought prize. The men stared, their weapons lowered, momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer audacity of his act and by the profound, enigmatic calm of the man before them. The mystery had deepened, revealing not simple desecration, but a purpose far more ancient and disturbing. The men of Harmony Creek surrounded Elias Thorne at the bottom of the ancient well, their faces a complex tapestry woven from fear, burgeoning anger, and profound, unyielding confusion. He made no attempt to resist, no move to flee, his calm and unsettling counterpoint to their collective agitation. He simply stood, clutching the small wooden box, his gaze sweeping over their faces, then up to the distant, hazy rim of the well, as if contemplating the vast, indifferent expanse of the sky above. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by their ragged, heavy breathing and the relentless, distant hum of the cicadas. Old Man Hemlock, finally recovering his voice, though it trembled with the effort, demanded answers. "What are you doing here, man? Why are you disturbing the dead? Why Harmony Creek?" Thorne finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet resonating with an unnerving clarity in the confined space of the well. He spoke not of his sister, nor of any personal grief that had driven him to this remote valley, but of a legacy, a lineage, and a profound, inescapable connection to the very soil beneath their feet. His words were not an explanation, but an invitation into a deeper, more unsettling enigma. He spoke of a pact made generations ago, a secret burden carried by a specific bloodline, a responsibility to those who had first settled this valley and then, inexplicably, vanished. He claimed that the true names of the original settlers were not merely those faintly visible on the crumbling stones, but ones obscured, hidden, intrinsically tied to the very essence of the land, to the valley's lifeblood. He had merely been fulfilling an ancient obligation, he asserted, gathering what had been scattered, restoring what had been lost, ensuring their memory, their very essence, would not truly fade into nothingness. He held up the small wooden box once more, his touch reverent, almost devotional. "This," he said, his voice imbued with a strange, almost ecstatic reverence, "is the final piece, the heart of their resting, the essence of their unbroken continuity." He offered no further elaboration. He did not explain the precise nature of the pact, the specific names he had found inscribed not on stone, but perhaps in some forgotten text or whispered lore, or the true, horrifying meaning of the ashes he had interred in the new grave. He simply looked at them, his eyes deep pools of unplumbed knowledge, as if expecting them to grasp a profound truth only he possessed, a truth far older and more terrifying than their own history. The men of Harmony Creek were left with a chilling, unsettling ambiguity, a gnawing uncertainty that would haunt their dreams. Was he mad, driven to a gruesome obsession by some inherited delusion? Or was he a true keeper of a terrible, hidden history, a secret that predated their own understanding of the valley, one that twisted the very fabric of their reality? They took Elias Thorne. He offered no resistance, walking calmly with them, the small wooden box still clutched in his hands, his face impassive. He was placed in the small, rarely used jail cell, a place as forgotten as the early settlers themselves, its rusty bars rattling with the profound implications of his presence. But the peace of Harmony Creek was shattered irrevocably. The knowledge of the disturbed graves, the carefully collected bones, and Thorne's cryptic, haunting words hung in the air like a shroud, casting a permanent shadow over their once bright valley. The urn he had brought, the ashes he claimed were human, now seemed to contain not just the remnants of death, but a profound, unending question, a spectral echo of lives that had never truly departed, merely transformed into something else. And in the quiet, isolated valley of Harmony Creek, where, by all accounts, no one had ever truly died, the unsettling truth was that perhaps no one had ever truly left either. The whispers would continue, but now they carried a chilling, indelible truth, forever changing the meaning of life and death in the valley of Harmony Creek. He was chipping away at something embedded deep within the well's ancient, unyielding wall, his movements precise, almost delicate, as if performing a meticulous surgical operation on the very bedrock of the valley. He turned slowly as they approached the well's edge, his face calm, almost serene, utterly devoid of fear or surprise. In his hands, he held a small, intricately carved wooden box, aged and brittle, its surface worn smooth by time and touch.
If you like this type of stories, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.